We had one other verse left in our other section, but I believe we've covered that sufficiently in our previous study. So we'll begin with the study of Abraham, and which is a very interesting study. We'll begin by asking someone to read verses 9, Galatians 3, verses 9 through 12, if you would, please. Excuse me. Let me get this back up. Verses 6 through 9. Galatians 3, verses 6 through 9.
Just as Abraham believed God, it was counted for him for righteousness. Therefore know that only those who are of the faith are sons of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel by Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. So then those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham.
Okay, thank you. Of course, in our general study of Galatians thus far, and the main theme throughout the book of Galatians is that of showing that there were those Judaizing teachers that had come into Galatia, to the churches of Galatia, and they were teaching that those Galatian Christians needed to add something to their salvation, to what they had done to become Christians, in addition to obedience to the gospel, and that was adding circumcision and certain other parts of the law to make their salvation complete. And Paul has gone through extensive teaching to that end to show that the works of the law do not justify. And now he's going to use Abraham to further his discussion and evidence that that is not correct and that the works of the law don't justify. And I find it very interesting that he uses Abraham here because the Jews, and I don't know that this would be the reason that he's using Abraham, but the Jews held Abraham very high, in very high regard. And certainly if I were one of those Judaizing teachers, I might use Abraham as part of the evidence that Abraham being a Jew, and all of the Jews look to Abraham as their father, Father Abraham, and use Abraham as evidence as here's Abraham that was circumcised, and therefore, if he is the father of all, then all of God's people, then here is a reason why you must be circumcised also. And so Paul would potentially, if that were the argument, he potentially would use Abraham at this part in his teaching to show that Abraham was justified by faith before and without the law. And so he begins with that. I think evidence of that we can find over in Matthew chapter 3. You recall when John was baptizing in the River Jordan, there were many that came from, in verse 5 it says, went out to him Jerusalem and all Judea and all the region round about Jordan, and were baptized of him in Jordan, confessing their sins. So it was something that was quite notable, and was not something that was not well published. To the extent, verse 7 says, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who has warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits for repentance. So he saw their hypocrisy. He didn't believe that they were genuine and wanting to truly confess their sins as he was preaching that they should do, that others were coming to do. And then he says in verse 9, and think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father, for I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. So these Pharisees and Sadducees would potentially, as John the Baptizer would say, he said, think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. They would appeal to Abraham. So potentially, this is what they would do here in trying to lead astray these Gentile converts in the churches of Galatia. And so Paul would address that Abraham, this issue, by talking about Abraham and how that Abraham was indeed the father of the Jews, but he was a child of God by faith, and as we study this, before and without the law. Now, we note in verse 6 it says that he believed God and it was accounted or imputed to him for righteousness. So all it says was that he believed God. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him. And I'm reading it, the King James Version. Our text in our book uses King James. And of course, I usually use King James myself, but it says it was accounted to him for righteousness. So that term accounted to him for righteousness is first found in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6. I'm not going to read that because that's just basically that and a few other things that is not really in the context of what I want to talk about, but it does say there that he believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. But I think we get a deeper understanding of how Abraham felt about what God said to him. Now, when we realize Abraham's situation and his wife's situation and the faith that Abraham showed when God made this promise to him, and he believed that promise and it was accounted to him for righteousness, I think we'll have a greater appreciation. If we'll turn to Romans, the 4th chapter, we begin in verse 18. And someone, if you would, begin reading in verses 18 and read through verse 24. Romans 4, 18 through 24.
In hope he believed against hope, that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told, so shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. That is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness. That the words it was counted to him were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him, who raised from the dead Jesus our Lord.
Okay. That's this shows the feelings that, or the belief that Abraham had when God made this promise to him. Now, first we note that Abraham, it says that he was 100 years old, and his wife was 90 years old, and yet it said that in verse 19 that, of course, the hope was he believed in hope that he'd become the father of many nations, and it says that he was not weak in faith, and that he did not consider his own body dead when he was yet about 100 years old. Neither did he consider the fact that Sarah's womb was dead. She was past the age of childbearing. He did not stagger, this is King James, at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. And 21 said he was fully persuaded what he had promised, that he was able also to perform it. And therefore it says, therefore it was imputed to him for righteousness. And that goes back to Genesis 15 and verse 6. And then it says it was not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. So this is how Abraham really believed. This is how strong his faith was. And in the situation, this is something that we would say is impossible. This could not happen. You know, we talk about the virgin birth of Jesus. Mary, being a virgin, gave birth to Jesus. Well, would you not say that a man that's almost 100 years old and his wife was past the age of being able to bear children, and yet God promised Abraham a son, and yet Abraham did not waver. His faith was strong. He staggered not at the promise. He believed that it would happen. And because of that strong faith, it says it was imputed to him for righteousness. Now, that's all we know. He believed it, and he believed it so strongly and so assuredly that it was counted to him for righteousness. Let's take this thought a little bit further. Let's go to Romans chapter 4, and let's back up to verses 9 through 13 of the same chapter. Someone read that, chapter 4, 9 through 13.
Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that the faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted, while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith.
Okay. Now, a different element is added here, which I think we need to note, but there's a special phrase I want us to bring out in this. Now, that is, when was the promise made? Was it made after Abraham was circumcised or before Abraham was circumcised? When was the promise made to Abraham? Before he was circumcised. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but I believe it is in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 3 that circumcision was introduced into the law of Moses. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 3. But the promise was made to Abraham, as we noticed in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6. Now, the original promise concerning that through his seed he would bless all nations of the earth is back in Genesis 12 and verse, slip me for just a moment, Genesis 12 and verse 3, where he talks about through his seed all nations would be blessed, referring to Christ. But see, the promise was made to Abraham before he was circumcised. And then the law, which came, we'll note when we get in the latter part of chapter 3 of Galatians, we'll note that 400 years later, after the promise was made to Abraham, the law was given. So the promise was made to Abraham concerning these blessings, and this blessing that he would make him a great nation, which is under discussion right now specifically, was made before circumcision and before the law. But so we need to understand that. That's an important thing to know, because they're trying to bind circumcision now potentially based on the fact of Abraham. Abraham was circumcised, and his descendants and those that came into his household were circumcised. Strangers that came in, they were circumcised. And so Abraham did have a covenant with God, and that covenant was based on, was signified through circumcision. So there's no question about that. But the promises were made before and without circumcision. But let's notice something very interesting in verse 12. Now, before it says he just believed God. and it was imputed unto him or accounted to him for righteousness. But let's notice in verse 12 a very interesting statement. And the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham. Did you get that? Who also walk in the steps of that faith. Here's Abraham that's talking about his faith. The faith of Abraham, he had faith and it was accounted to him to righteousness. But notice what it says. Those that also walk in the steps of that faith. So Abraham's faith that was accounted to him unto righteousness, there were some steps. There was some action. There was something that Abraham did that in his faith, as a part of his faith, that God accounted to Abraham for righteousness. I've read that a lot of times. I never noticed that. Who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham. That faith of who? Of our father Abraham. So Abraham had all this faith. But along with that faith, there was some action. There was something that Abraham did. Now, we're not going to spend, hopefully, the entire class on this, but we all know about our heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Let's very quickly turn to there, Hebrews chapter 11. Let's note in verse 8 beginning, and we're not going to take all the time, but just to make these points and then try to make some application. By faith, what did God say he accounted as righteousness? It was Abraham's faith. But what did we read? Walking in the steps of Abraham's faith. Now, what did those steps do? What made up those steps? Well, in verse 8 it says of Hebrews 11, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. What is that? That is faith acting. He's walking by faith. Abraham walked by faith. But it says that he believed and it was imputed to him for righteousness. But you know, what kind of faith did he have? He had faith that worked. And part of that, in verse 8 it says, he was called to go into a place that he should receive as inheritance. He obeyed and he went out. And he didn't know where he was going, but he obeyed anyway. He was told to go, he obeyed, and he didn't even know where he was going. God said, you go here, and he went, not even know where he was going. By faith he sojourned in a land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles or tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Now, this just for our benefit, for he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now, that city that he is looking for, that inheritance, that place that he was going by land that God sent him to, that wasn't the city that he was looking for. Here in verse 10, he looked for a heavenly city. He looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. You know, he was following God's directions, and he went out not knowing where he was going, and he dwelt as a stranger in this land, in tents with his sons, with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city. For a city here on this earth? No. He looked for a heavenly city, which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Let's look a little bit further. Let's go over to same chapter, verses 17 and 18. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, when he was tested, when his faith was tested, what did he do? By faith, he believed God, and it was imputed to him for righteousness. But what kind of faith did he have? When that faith was tried, he offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. This is the son that he promised. Number one, you have to have one son to have a multitude of descendants as the stars of heaven, and to have a descendant that's going to bless all nations. And we'll talk more about that later in chapter 3. Verse 18, of whom it is said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. What kind of faith did Abraham have? It was the kind of faith that God accounted or imputed to him for righteousness, but it was a faith that obeyed God. Now we can go, of course, and look at Ephesians, or rather James chapter 2, there where it specifically talks about this event and referring to it as an event where God, with Abraham did this and God accounted that, as righteousness, and it's showing that faith without works is dead. But the point I'm making here is the kind of faith that Abraham had is the kind of faith that works. It's the kind of faith that obeys. So let's make a brief application of that. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. I think that we've already made the application, but let's make it a little clearer and a little more specific to us. Ephesians 2 and verse 8. And those that will not accept the truth of God, the teachings of God, the plain teachings of God, they'll go to this verse, which is a true, it's the truth, but they will twist it and pervert it. But in verse 8 it says, for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And those that will not accept plain teaching of the Scriptures say that when we say that a person has to be baptized to have their sins washed away, then they say that we're saying that we are saying that we have to work, and the Bible says not of works, lest any man should boast. We've seen clearly so far in the book of Galatians that the works of the law will not justify. We read here in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 9, it's not of works that we do, of our own device, our own mind, our own choosing, that will save us, that we could boast about. But just as Abraham was justified, he obeyed God by doing what God told him to do, then that faith justified him. It really was that faith that obeyed that caused God to impute righteousness to Abraham. When we tell someone in Acts 2 and verse 38, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, and they reject it, it's not the works of the law, it's not works that we can boast of, but it's what God has told us through his inspired word. Then when we do that, then we're doing nothing more, nothing less than what Abraham did, and we're being justified, or we are justified when one does that. Nothing more, nothing less. And other teachings that are rejected, that's plain in the Bible, just as simple as that, and others, there's no difference. So Abraham's faith that was imputed to him for righteousness, when we look at it in depth, we see that that faith was a faith that we need to walk in the steps of the faith of Abraham. And those steps were steps of faith that obeyed and did what God told him to do. And we need to do the same thing. We need to have the faith that will obey God. When he tells us to do something in his scripture, we need to do those things. And we need to do those things for the same reason that Abraham did. And what reason was that? What was Abraham looking for? He was looking for a city. We need to be doing it for the same reason that Abraham did. We need to be looking for that city. We need to look at things that are above and not things upon this earth. We need to have just as Moses left Egypt because he had respect or regard for things that were above and not for things on this earth. And so we need to have that same mindset. We believe what God says. We do it because we understand there is a reward for those that do the things that God teaches us to do. And when we do that, what are we doing? We're walking by faith. We're walking by faith, and we're justified by faith, just as Abraham was justified by faith. I know that's not anything new, but the time was spent for Paul by inspiration, to give us that insight in that verse, and I thought it was important that we bring those out. Any comments on verse 6? Verse 7 says, "Know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham." And we'll go ahead and move over to chapter 3 and read verses 26 through 29. It says, "For ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you be Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." If that doesn't explain that verse, if you therefore know you therefore that they that are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. Verse 8 says, "In the scriptures, before seeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In these shall all the nations be blessed." And we can read that in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3. Someone please turn over to Genesis chapter 12. Let's see if there's more than one verse I want to have read there. But Genesis chapter 12. Let's read verses 1 through 3. Genesis 12, 1 through 3.
"Now the Lord had said to Abram, Get out of the country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
Okay. So we have several blessings here, but on verse 3, the last part, "In these shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And when we get later in chapter 3, we'll understand the blessing in In verse 16 it says, now to Abraham and to his seed were the promises made. He saith, not to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So Paul is going back to Genesis chapter 3, chapter 12 and verse 3, and that is the reference to what the promise is to Abraham at that time. And verse 9 says, so then they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. And I think we've covered that. In fact, I don't even have a reference down for that. We've covered that with the things that we've discussed already. So any questions on anything concerning Abraham and the promises made to Abraham concerning how that he believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness? Any comments or questions? All right, the next section we have is beginning in verse 10 through verse 14, and this is concerning the curse. If we look at our books, we'll be on page 30 at the top of the page, and it says the law cannot justify, but it can bring a curse. Not only can, but it did bring a curse. And I guess those that would try to be justified by the law today it would still bring a curse. And so, again, contrasting the law of Moses with the teaching of the law of Christ. And so Paul is now going to discuss how that the law would bring a curse to those that would try to keep the law. And we begin with verse 10. Someone please read verses 10 through 14.
For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law, to do them. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Yet the law is not of faith, but the man who does them shall live by them. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, that the blessings of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in Christ Jesus, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith.
Okay. So those that would try to keep the law of Moses at that time or at this time now would be under the curse of the law of Moses, because the law of Moses brought a curse. And if we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 21 and hold our Bibles there, there's some reading there, just 21 verses 22 and 23. And there's our first reading there. And here we have concerning the idea of the law being a curse. And it says in beginning in verse 22 of Deuteronomy 21, and if a man, and this is among several punishments and so on in the Old Testament law, and if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So if the punishment for the sin is death, and the penalty is that he be crucified, the law teaches that he not remain on the tree crucified overnight, and he's to be taken down that day. And the reason is that the land be not defiled, which the Lord had given them for inheritance. And in quotation marks, in my Bible it says, "For he that is hanged is accursed of God." So this is the idea of, being cursed under the Old Testament law. There are other reasons that one would be cursed under the Old Testament law, is that it was impossible that one could be forgiven of sins. We've talked about this in our past studies, and we go to Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, and particularly the idea is that sins are not forgiven under the Old Testament law because there's a remembrance each year of sins, because it's not possible, verse 4, that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. So that would be a curse of the law. And so that would keep one from, that would, in a sense, be a curse of the law. But while we're in Deuteronomy, we want to go over to chapter 27 in Deuteronomy. And in 27, we'll read verse 26. Now this is another curse of the law, and this is something I think that was more primarily in mind about being cursed by the law, and that is the inability to keep the law. Verse 26 of chapter 27 says, "Cursed be he that confirmeth not all the words of this law to do them, and all the people shall say, Amen." So to keep the law, you had to keep all of the law. You had to keep every word of the law. We can read in James chapter 2 and verse 10 that if one offends in one law, one point of the law, or one sin in the law, they are guilty of all the law. And then we've noticed in Acts, the 15th chapter, which we referred to, there is the council at Jerusalem. Acts 15 and verse 10, we have where this problem is first discussed. And Paul and Barnabas come down to Jerusalem to discuss this problem, and there are Judaizing teachers that come down and they make their case, and Peter is the first to speak. And of course we know Peter is the one that was took part, or was the apostle that was involved in the first Gentile converts. But in verse 10 it says, "Now therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples?" And he's talking about the Gentile disciples. "To put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear." They couldn't keep the law. They could not keep the law. He says, neither our fathers nor we were able to bear. So here's the curse of the law. So that's what is under consideration here. And so the law is in verse 10, "For as many as are under the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, Cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them." And so here's the curse. Any comments on that expression, on that part of that verse? Or on that verse? Well, I got a lot of participation today, don't I? Verse 11 says, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, the just shall live by faith. Now, we've already noticed in Galatians 2 and verse 16, which we've studied recently, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So he simply states, but no flesh is justified by the works of the law in the sight of God. And it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. And so we want to talk about the just living by faith. So over in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, we noted this just recently, but the idea here again is justification by faith and not by works. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, for it is written, the just shall live by faith. So the idea is we can't be justified by the law. There's a curse that is for those that would keep the law, because they would have to keep all that's written in the law. And so no one could be justified by the law. And therefore, it's evident that the just shall live by faith. And we'll begin with verse 12. We'll begin our study again next week. Appreciate those that read for us.